Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lee Edelman. He is Fletcher Professor of English Literature at Tufts University. He began his academic career as a scholar of 20th-century American poetry. He has since become a central figure in the development, dissemination, and rethinking of queer theory. His current work explores the intersections of sexuality, rhetorical theory, cultural politics, and film. He is the author of several books, including the one we're going to focus on today, No Future, Queer Theory, and The Death Drive. So, Dr. Edelman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
I'm happy to be here with you, Ricardo.
So, my first question would be, how do you look at the relationship between symbolism and politics?
Well, to answer that question, I think we have to take a step back and ask what we understand by politics. And for me, politics has to be understood as the various processes by which controversy, argument, and consensus around shaping a polity, a collectivity, is negotiated. And to that extent, politics itself is always about rhetoric. It's always about the production of a coherent body, a unity. So symbolism is invariably at the core of politics because the political symbol is the coherence of the polity itself. And all of the arguments, all of the dissent, to speak to the title of your podcast, all of the dissent that is central to political operation is centered on trying to appropriate or disseminate a symbol that will totalize, that will make coherent the potentially disparate forces that constitute a political body. The way in which symbolism can be used by various factions within that polity are always in the service of a vision of how that polity itself symbolizes something beyond itself, symbolizes something like meaning itself. So for there to be politics, for there to be a polity, a collectivity, there is always some sense in which the argument is an argument about meaning, and thus symbolism is going to be inseparable from it.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you focus on a very specific symbol, the child. What does it represent politically?
Well, the first thing to say is that the child is, throughout the book, identified with a capital C. So the child is not to be confused with actual real-world children, and that's part of the problem, as we will see in a minute. The child is an image of the collectivity itself, as always in the process of development, formation, and preservation, so that the child becomes the image within most political structures of the very goal of constructing the political body as a living entity. Toward that end, the state, if it is a state, will be imaged in terms of the need to perpetuate itself, to preserve itself, to conserve itself, which is why politics is so bound up with conservatism, even when the politics are liberal or radical. The politics of conservation at the core of the conceptualization of a political entity as a coherent body finds its best representation in the child, capital C, in whose name that polity is being constructed and perpetuated. So the child becomes the, I think I said in the book, the perpetual horizon of the political endeavor itself. The politics of a given collectivity are on both sides in general going to be framed as serving the interests of the child as the image of the future, which is not the image of any one child's future, but the image of the future of that political structure as it embodies itself in the idea of a child. So actual real world children will often be sacrificed to the idea of the child because the child is precisely a symbol of the polity itself.
Mhm. And that, I think, connects us to the concept of reproductive futurism, correct? Could you tell us about it?
It does. So in New Future, No Future, I produced this term of reproductive futurism to describe um, the engine of broad numbers of social polities. That is to say, the imperative of a collectivity insofar as it is engaged in the political struggle for recognition and survival is always to reproduce itself and to assure that it, in reproducing itself, reproduces what it conceives of as its privileged access to meaning. The conflict among political ideologies, after all, is always a conflict about what does it mean to live together? What does it mean to form a society? And how should that society be articulated? The predicate of all of those issues is that there is a meaning to society, and the society should preserve its meaning. Thus, the very idea of futurism is that the future is not simply what will come next. The future is the image of what already has been and must be preserved. So reproductive futurism is the logic by which in social organizations, all of us are compelled to imagine the possibility of a becoming, which is always, in fact, a repetition of what has already been understood as our being. To that extent, reproductive futurism is actually a logic by which a future as difference is prohibited from happening, precisely because one could appeal to different philosophical registers to express this, but precisely to the extent that what various philosophers would call an event, a radical transformation, an eruption of what has not been recognizable within the structure of things as they are, is conceptualized in the logic of reproductive futurism precisely as destructive, as an undoing of the order of meaning, because the order of meaning is seen as simply being that which it always already has been, and therefore must always be.
Mhm. Could you characterize those that, in your own terms, are fighting for, or represent the side that is fighting for the children?
Well, fairly easily, because that's basically everyone. All of us are acculturated to think of ourselves through the logic of reproductive futurism, which means that all of us are acculturated to think of ourselves as on the side of the children, where the children are simply the massification of the child. And thus you can have in contemporary politics, say like those of the United States today, you can have movements where in a state like Alabama, it has now been, it has become criminal to provide trans children with any medical support to reinforce their transition. Thus, these actual living children are sacrificed on the altar of an idea of the child that must be conceived as heterosexual, as reproductive, as conforming to an ideology that perpetuates the meaning of the sex gender system as it has been received. So that on the conservative side, one can clearly say, even though the persons who are instituting this absolute prohibition on assisting in any way or providing information about transitioning to trans children, they are clearly creating conditions that are going to be destructive to the mental and mental health and possibly even the lives of trans children who, as we know, are at higher risks of depression and suicide. But they will do this in the name of the child. On the other hand, the left will also be fighting for the children to the extent that they will say, but think of these children. These trans children need these resources in order to survive in an environment which is unable and unwilling to recognize their identities. To that extent, the contestation as a political contestation is one in which both sides mirror the discourse of reproductive futurism produced by the other, because every side presents itself as fighting for the children. Mm-hmm. The alternative, which would be a queer politics, were it possible, would be a politics that no longer sees the future as the horizon of our existence, but recognizes instead something like the imperative of a present with its link to what in Lacanian psychoanalysis is called jouissance, or enjoyment, or the expression of drive, which is an unconscious force that controls and shapes our actions at every moment without our volition or will. The queer politics would see that engagement with drive and jouissance as dismantling both futurity and our investment in futurity, and dismantling our recognition of our sense of ourselves. As you can see, even from that very brief sketch of what that queer politics would look like, it's not a politics that very many people would or could practice, because you can't practice a politics of the drive. The drive, being unconscious, can't be harnessed, it can't be turned to an object that one is trying to shape a political structure through. And indeed, the very idea of shaping a political structure presupposes that one wants to produce something within a register of meaning that is going to have some enduring existence. So to some extent, the alternative to the politics of fighting for the child is a step outside of what is recognizable as politics.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean in the book by the child as an end that is endlessly postponed?
Well, the history of a family, like the history of a nation, or like the history of a civilization, is always seen as needing another step, another link in the chain of its perpetuation. So there is no more the possibility of saying, your child has had a child, so therefore the links in the chain of this family are completed, than there is to say that we have protected the laws of a given civilization against those who would undo them, and therefore we have achieved the realization of the society in the form of the child that we intended. There is always a new threat to the child. The child is always perpetually under threat, precisely because dissent, politics as dissent, is precisely about a disagreement concerning the way in which collectivities should be organized and meaning should be understood. It's not necessarily a disagreement about the imperative of meaning, but it's a disagreement about the terms of meaning. And therefore, it's a disagreement between the two sides that are both fighting for the child, and both of them see the other or the others as threats to the way in which their vision of the perpetuation of meaning, and so the perpetuation of the child, and so the perpetuation of the polity should be carried out.
Mm-hmm. You've already touched on queerness, but would you characterize it as a form of sexual expression, or is it something else?
Like any word, queerness can be used by different people to signify different things. As I use queerness, it is not in and of itself what we understand as a form of sexual expression. That is to say, one could not define queerness particular set of acts or as a particular set of identities. In fact, as I've said many times, queerness is not an identity, but it's the dismantling of identities. It can never be an identity, but can only disturb an identity. So to that extent, what I understand queerness to function as is first and foremost a figure. And it's important to say a few words about what I mean by a figure. If the political institutions that are fighting for the child, indeed, if the political institutions that have constructed the image and ideology of the child are bound up with what I've been calling reproductive futurism, it's important to see that, first of all, what we have called the symbol of the child is actually a figure. It's a figure insofar as it stands for something else. It doesn't stand for children per se. It stands ultimately for the idea of the state in its collective unity and for the idea of the meaning that the state in its collective unity perpetuates. If figure then is always something that takes the place of or stands in for something else, queerness too is a figure. Queerness is not an affirmative or positive condition that is produced by the individuals who may be defined or define themselves as queer. Queerness is always a diacritical function that stands in opposition to what a collective articulates as the rules of its existence. Hence, queerness is always what is outside a structure of norms. It may well, and in many cases will be, it may well be, and in many cases is, defined in relation to or stigmatized in relation to deviations from sexual norms. But sexual norms aren't the only norms through which queerness can be articulated. In modern culture, queerness has been redefined by those who had previously been stigmatized by it as a positive identity. And to that extent, it comes to proclaim the possibility of owning as an identity what had previously been merely a stigmatized condition. To that extent, we have to realize that those who are identifying themselves as queer or claiming that identity are ignoring or negating or obscuring its fully figural condition, which is to say, no one is a queer. No one is a queer except insofar as a culture has first stigmatized certain conditions as threats to its normativity. One can then identify with that position of threat, but one is only a threat insofar as the norm conceives one as a threat. So if you ask me then, what is queerness? The first thing I would say is that queerness is not. It's not an ontological condition. It's not a condition of being. It's a condition of representing. And what it represents is variable. What is queer today will not necessarily be queer tomorrow. Indeed, the origins of queer theory and queer thinking mark a differentiation from what preceded them, which was a discipline within the academy that was called gay and lesbian studies. The movement from the one to the other, from gay and lesbian studies to queer, is a movement that recognizes, first of all, that gay and lesbian studies, sexuality studies, don't encompass the entirety of queerness, but also that recognizes, and we have increasingly seen this happen throughout the certain classes of persons in certain largely urban areas in certain so-called Western democracies, that even lesbian and gay lives no longer necessarily coincide with what is conceptualized as queer. That the idea of, for instance, gay marriage has been normalized in many Western societies now. And to that extent, is not in itself necessarily seen as being queer. That doesn't mean that queerness has itself been normalized. It just means that the locus of queerness has, for many in those societies, moved somewhere else. So now what will be stigmatized as queer may be trans lives, which is in the US now the primary route through which the opposition to non-normativity is being articulated. Queerness then is a condition by which one is stigmatized by a normative culture and produced as an entity through the figuralization in your person of a threat to the perpetuation of normative meaning.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that queerness is anti-life?
Well, I would not say queerness is anti-life, because that would presuppose that there were a clear sense of queerness as an ontological condition that could be one thing or another. But what I would say is that queerness is always perceived as anti-life by those who occupy the position of the norm. The reason that queerness is stigmatized is because it is construed as anti-life. That doesn't mean that those who are stigmatized as queer need be anti-life, but what they are seen as being is opposed to the perpetuation of the structures by which the value of life for the normative figure in a given social order is constructed. Thus, is the queer anti-life? Sometimes they might be. One could certainly say that some avowed queers are opposed to the imperative that life be lived according to the set terms of the dominant order. But does that mean that they're anti-life? For the most part, those who are stigmatized as queer are not anti-life.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you also talk about another term that I think is very central to what you explore there, Sinthomosexuality. Could you explain it?
That's an open question as to whether I can explain it, but I can certainly try.
Okay.
In order to do so, we have to, again, take a few steps backwards. So this is a word that is a neologism, obviously, and it's constructed of two different terms from two different traditions. So on the one hand, you have the term symptôme, which is a term that was introduced by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan to describe an aspect of the human subject. Now, to understand this aspect of the human subject, we have to go back to a word I used before, which was jouissance, or enjoyment. For Lacanian psychoanalysis, the subject is always a divided subject, divided, as psychoanalysis always insists, between the conscious and the unconscious, but divided also, therefore, between desire and drive. We are desiring subjects insofar as we are conscious of the objects of our desire. But we are also subjects who are, as unconscious subjects, shaped by the drive of which we are unconscious, which impels us to enact behaviors that often are at odds with what we claim we desire. So we all know those people who say things like, I don't know why the people I wind up with always do X. And one is always tempted to say to them, well, maybe it's because, despite what you say, you're actually always seeking out people who do X. Now, consciously, the person is going to say something like, well, of course not. The reason these relationships always end is because I can't stand people who do X. But the reason that those relationships have begun is also, of course, because they are drawn to people who do X. So the tension between those two things makes clear that the drive, which is leading us in Lacanian parlance toward jouissance, to enjoyment, to an experience which is not pleasure per se, but is an excess of experiential intensity, which is beyond pleasure and constitutes the site where pleasure and pain become indistinguishable. That jouissance can be seen in miniature in the way in which the person who keeps repeating the same history of bad erotic choices is in fact simultaneously attempting to realize desire and drive in the same object and finding the incompatibility of those two things. With that as just a sort of basis to understand what we can then go on to talk about as the symptôme, Lacan says the symptôme is the structure by which each of us as a subject is impelled toward a particular form of jouissance. What is it, Lacan asks, that determines what we get off on? Why is it that going to a rock concert can induce ecstasy in certain people that is analogous to, and in some ways, as Slavoj Žižek would argue, to some extent even indistinguishable from the ecstasies that you might see other people experiencing in when they start talking in tongues in an evangelical church service, which is then itself analogous to the way some people in a mob scene or in a crowd which is moved to frenzied riots then lose control of themselves and just give way to primal emotions and experiences. For Lacan, all of these different ways of experiencing enjoyment, of experiencing that moment where you exceed yourself, where you experience what in Greek would be termed ecstasy, an ekstasis, a movement beyond one's own being. All of those ways of experiencing enjoyment as a form of movement beyond the distinction between pleasure and pain, or a movement beyond what Freud would call the pleasure principle. All of those are determined by a structure within the individual which has no meaning. It's just what Lacan calls the symptôme, the specific way in which each subject is attached to enjoyment, in a certain sense, from the outset. Just the ways in which you express your experience of enjoyment. That symptôme is what undoes us as conscious and willful subjects. It marks the site within each of us of something that is incomprehensible and outside the register of meaning. To that extent, we could say that the symptôme for Lacan is like a psychic fingerprint. If you look at your fingerprint, it has no meaning, but it is allegedly unique to you. It's just a marker of what you are. That's why it can be used in forensic determinations of culpability for crimes. The symptôme, similarly for Lacan, is a fingerprint of sorts, but it's a psychic fingerprint that simply says, you are that. That's what you are, but what you are does not have an explanation that could be reduced to meaning or value. In fact, the symptôme seems to dismantle meaning and value to the extent that it takes the consciousness of the subject out of the picture. It makes us all into, in a certain sense, puppets controlled by forces that are in excess of ourselves. It undoes the fantasy of our own sovereignty. The symptôme then is the locus of non-sovereignty within each of us who thinks of ourselves as a sovereign subject. Sinthomosexuality then combines that lack of meaning and that non-sovereignty with sexuality to see that sexualities that are seen as not conforming to the production or the reproduction of meaning and thus not conforming to the production or the reproduction of the established social order, will be identified as Sinthomosexualities, and thus as threats to the perpetuation of that social order, and become figures for what I would say is the sexuality within sexuality itself. And to explain what I mean by that, just a very quick coda. Sinthomosexualities bear the burden of sexualization. An example. In Florida in the United States, it has recently become illegal to talk about sexual orientation or sexual identities or sexualities in grades kindergarten through third grade, and then only in age-appropriate ways, whatever that means, in subsequent grades. This is the so-called Don't Say Gay bill that has been passed in the state of Florida in 2022. Now, the thing to understand about this is that to identify oneself as, let's say, a gay man, a lesbian, a bisexual, is ipso facto to be seen as introducing sexuality and sex into the classroom, in a way that introducing yourself as Mr. Smith married to Mrs. Smith is not seen as introducing sex or sexuality into the classroom. To be a heterosexual, or even to be as heterosexuals who have decided to reproduce are often said to be trying to have a baby, is not seen as engaging in sexuality in the overt form. It is seen rather as conducing to socially validated or valorized ends. Whereas simply to articulate one's being, regardless of one's doing, as a lesbian, bisexual, gay man, trans person, is to be seen as sexualizing discourse. Thus, Sinthomosexuality bears the stigma of sexuality itself in order to purge heterosexuality of its implication in the sexual.
Mm-hmm. What is it that in the book you call a culture of death?
Well, I don't refer to a culture of death directly. I talk about the fact that the Catholic Church had identified, especially before Pope Francis, various forms of modern life as perpetuating a culture of death. So for those aspects of the church and of the Catholic Church, and for many in Protestant fundamentalist churches, and for many conservative, reactionary, or authoritarian politicians around the globe, including Trump in the US, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, one could go on and on, the association of modernism in the West and of expanded rights and opportunities for women, for those who identify as part of the so-called LGBTQIAA+ community, is seen as promulgating a culture of death insofar as it establishes the possibility of experiencing a life outside of the norms of reproductive futurism. Hence, anything that does not conduce to the primacy and value as the ultimate value of social organization, of reproductive futurism, is condemned as a culture of death, including, therefore, reproductive freedoms for women, including sexual opportunities, including for sexual minorities, including the extension of the rights to marriage and to equal social benefits to those who identify as queer. All of those things promulgate a culture of death to the extent that they represent the possibility of the undoing of the structures of meaning by which the entrenched order has established its own horizon of value.
With what we've been talking about in mind, where would you say political movements against homosexuality stem from?
Well, I think they stem from the same roots that all resistance to non-normative logics stem, and that is the anxiety about the porousness, the vulnerability of the structures by which a collectivity can recognize itself, so that the question of homosexuality, for instance, in particular, has always been legible as a question of how a community can perpetuate its strength as a coherent entity if it is at the same time engaging in practices that figure the penetration in particular of the male body, and thus the undoing of the male body's coherence, which is in and of itself the figure of the coherence of the state. In other words, we have to recognize, as I'm sure you and your listeners do, that attitudes toward homosexuality and laws about homosexuality vary widely historically. It's not as if there is some a priori intrinsic repugnance from or reaction against homosexuality. But as soon as there is a social collectivity, even in those cultures like that are famously described or evoked by moderns as cultures of homosexuality, homosexuality was seen as, which is to say same-sex sexual relations, because homosexuality, as Foucault reminds us, is itself a conceptual product of the 19th century. But same-sex sexual relations in those so-called cultures of homosexuality were always only seen as intensified bonds of relation between men that supplemented heterosexual reproduction, and that were proper only between men who had reached adulthood and young boys prior to the arrival of those boys at adulthood. So it wasn't actually same-sex sexuality, insofar as what one could say that in those cultures, childhood was not sexed as male or female. There were boys and there were girls, but the puer was not a man, and thus the conceptualization of sex between an adult man and the puer was not, in a certain sense, a same-sex relationship, so much as it was a man-boy relationship. That, of course, in contemporary society, is to raise the specter of the most resolutely queered of all sexual positions, pedophilia, which has occupied now for some time the terrain of that which one cannot even talk about without risking stigmatization.
Mm-hmm. And with what we've talked about concerning the concept of the child with a capital C and reproductive futurism, how would that apply to anti-abortion movements?
Well, as we've seen, the anxiety about threats to the integrity, the boundaries of, the coherence of a social order means that the protection, the defense of that polity is first and foremost a defense of its ways of conceptualizing value. Now, it is by no means the case that one cannot produce an ethical, value-laden argument for reproductive freedom. And indeed, that's precisely what the proponents of reproductive freedom have done. And that indeed is one of the reasons why, even in this answer to your question, when I say the word reproductive freedom, what we do is move away from the word abortion, because reproductive freedom sublimates the reality that abortion is an act that entails a certain degree of conceptual violence. Now, the anti-abortion movement is a movement that largely opposes abortion for religious reasons. And it is important to recognize, as Lacan points out, that meaning is fundamentally a religious concept. In other words, to ascribe meaning to the world is always to construct the basis for a theology, even if it's only a secular theology. Every form of understanding the world is a way of constructing a frame that totalizes that world within the logic of a meaning. So when we say that the anti-abortion movement is largely a religious movement, the important thing to recognize is that even when it purports not to come from established, or not to be based in the tenets of established religions, it is still a movement whose religion is the meaning of the child as the figure of life itself. And thus, the prohibition on the termination of even a potential life is cognate with the prohibition on the termination of the meaning of life in a social order. Now, the irony, as many people have pointed out, is that concern for that potential life for many in the anti-abortion movement seems to end with birth, so that once the child is actually born, its value in terms of, say, providing it with safety from police violence, or providing it with nurture that will allow it to live, or providing it with the circumstances to keep it from succumbing to poverty, all of those things cease to matter once the child is born to many, because at that point, the child has free will and agency, is a sovereign subject. The anti-abortion movement is so invested in the fetus because the fetus is the exemplar of a subject who lacks the sovereignty to control its own destiny. And thus it becomes the figure of potential sovereignty in the face of actual non-sovereignty. Now, what's important about that is that potential sovereignty is what drives the social order itself. None of us ever have sovereignty. All of us are constantly in any collective, as also in our status as psychic subjects, experiencing the division between sovereignty and non-sovereignty. But the ideal is to attain to that position of agential power, and thus to overcome the constraint of limitation, of what in religious or theological discourse would be called nature, in order to become wholly the spirit. To that extent, reproductive futurism is a version of religion too, and its salvific figure, its savior, is the child, as it is in Christian religions as well, the child that can, especially in the form of the fetus, represent it as pure potential, unadulterated, unmarked, untainted by the reality of succumbing to nature, and undiminished by the reality of the choices that it will make once it's born.
So, one last question. Does your work, and particularly the topics you explore in this book, No Future, connect in any way to antinatalism?
Well, it could, but it needn't, which is to say, antinatalism is in and of itself a movement that promulgates a vision of a social order that is predicated on a system of values. And thus, its imperative is to articulate a sort of ideal, both ethical and political, by which human lives should be regulated. To that extent, it presupposes its own place within the political order as just another political voice that is saying that this is the best way to shape a society. So even if you go back and, and Lacan talks about this in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, he talks about a sort of very early antinatalist society, the Cathars, who believed that reproduction was evil. And there are periodically through time, there are religious communities that decide that in order to purify themselves of their implication in a fallen nature, they must avoid the reproduction of that fallen nature. But that antinatalism does not escape by any means the religious imperative toward meaning that is invested in reproductive futurism. It simply transforms it into a wholly spiritual practice, or in the case of other non-religious antinatalist movements, into a wholly ethical practice. For me, the grounds of religion and the grounds of ethics must be equally interrogated. We are constrained as subjects living within a political structure to act ethically with relation to each other. But no one can ever articulate a ground for ethics, a ground by which an ethical possibility will coincide with the reality of human possibility. So that Lacan famously has a passage in which he talks about, precisely insofar as we are divided subjects, the impossibility of ever satisfying our desire and our drive at the same time. Precisely because what we want is antithetical. We want, as subjects of desire, what may be antithetical to what we unconsciously want as subjects of the drive. Hence, how do we act ethically? How do we do justice? When to do justice would have to mean satisfying those demands that are perpetually in conflict, demands that we act ethically toward subjects that are in conflict with themselves. That's the conflict that ethics proposes, and that's why a queer position, if it could be articulated, would not be a political position that is trying to establish a new society or a better foundation for that society. The queer position is always going to be the position that is, to go back to the title of your podcast, the dissenter's position. It's going to be the one that dissents from every social structure, precisely because it speaks for and as that which the social structure cannot accommodate. That's why in the book that is finally coming out at the end of this year as the follow-up to No Future, Bad Education, what I argue is that every social order exists to exclude from thinkability what we could articulate as nothing, the nothingness, the space of what is reduced to nothing because it can't be seen, articulated, or recognized by the society as it exists. I mean, we talk readily today, for instance, about trans children or trans adults. But 200 years ago, that phrase would not have meant anything. And the person in Western society who felt themselves not to be properly gendered at birth would not be recognizable except perhaps as an effeminate man or as a butch woman who would then be slotted into categories of sexual deviance rather than gender deviance per se. All sorts of categories of possible lives are unrecognized by us at this very moment. They are the nothing in the midst of our society. They are the queers who have no names, who will gain names in time to come, and as they gain names will gain identities, and then will think of themselves as ontological positions instead of as diacritical possibilities. The nothing is the place of the queer. The queer is on the side of the nothing. And it's not on the side of founding a society in which the rights of nothing will be protected, because we can't protect the rights of those that are not yet identifiable. Thus, there is no structure that will accommodate queerness. Queerness is what instead structurally resists the integrity of every structure. It's the internal discontinuity of every political structure that insists not on founding an alternative structure, but on recognizing the necessity of dissolving the one we have.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Apart from the book, Dr. Edelman, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Well, I'm not one for social media. I don't have a website. The Bad Education, the new book, is coming out from Duke University Press. There are probably other sites that deal with my work, but I don't check them out, so I can't be of help there.
Okay, no problem at all. I will be leaving some links at least to your faculty page and to the rest of your book. So, Dr. Edelman, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Thank you very much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Lononio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Aima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Adriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.